So in chapter 4, we're continuing our look at the origins of criminal behavior by looking at learning theories and situational factors. And we've kind of touched a little bit on learning theories when we talked about Albert Bandura and social learning theory or modeling. Now, there are three types of learning that we look at. And these are from psychology, by the way. And so if you've taken a psych class, you've probably already studied these a little bit. So these might be familiar to you. So these three theories from psychology have been applied to how criminal behavior may be learned. Now, the first one is classical conditioning. Now, classical conditioning is related to automatic or reflexive behaviors. So the fact that you perhaps may have anxiety when you go to the dentist, that's something you can't control. It's completely automatic. You've learned to associate maybe the dentist chair with pain. And so you have this anxiety response that's automatic and reflexive. It's not really one that applies naturally to criminal behavior because criminal behavior is voluntary. Classical conditioning was really discovered by Ivan Pavlov. You see, he talks about Pavlovian there. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who by accident learned that he could classically condition dogs to have a salivation response at just the sound of his feet or the sound of a bell. That's not a normal response for dogs. But they learned to associate food with the sound of a bell, and so they would salivate at the sound of the bell. And it's classical conditioning because salivation at the presentation of food is automatic. And the second one is, excuse me, instrumental learning, also really known as operant conditioning in psychology. Operant conditioning was really pushed forward in the 1950s and 1960s by V.F. Skinner, who's a very famous psychologist. And it simply is the idea that behavior is shaped and maintained by its rewards. And we're talking about voluntary behavior here. So with classical conditioning, that is reflexive, not really applicable to criminal behavior. But with operant conditioning, we're talking about voluntary behavior. And so that would definitely be applicable to criminal behavior. So behavior that is rewarded, it increases the likelihood that that behavior will be repeated. Behavior that is punished, theoretically, it reduces the likelihood that that behavior will be repeated. So with criminal behavior, the person engages in a behavior and they get some type of reward for that, whether that is financial reward or material or some type of psychological reward. It increases the likelihood that they're going to engage in that behavior again, where if they're theoretically punished for doing a behavior, it decreases the likelihood. That's theoretical with punishment because punishment doesn't really work. Social learning theory, we've already talked about. That is Albert Bandura and the idea that people imitate or model behavior by watching others. So that's, applicable to your family of origin, from your friends, even things like television shows or video games. There has been some suggestion that people learn behaviors through those means as well. So behaviorism is a perspective in psychology that became popular in the 1950s. It was inspired by the work of Ivan Pavlov with the dogs. But there was a psychologist named John Watson who believed that he could classically condition a human to have a response, which he did with a child. It's a very famous study called the Little Albert study. He actually was able to create a phobic response to animals in a baby. And again, a phobic response of fear, that would be classical conditioning because it's an automatic or reflexive behavior. So this perspective, inspired by Pavlov, John Watson, became incredibly influential here in the United States in the 1950s, later B.F. Skinner with operant conditioning. And behaviorism really is the idea that everything about us is learned. So they really discount the idea of the unconscious influences of like Freudian psychology. It really focuses on the conscious experience and suggests that psychology should only pay attention to and measure what can be publicly observed and measured empirically with evidence. So really highly based in the scientific method, discounting the ideas of the unconscious, and with really the idea that everything about us is learned. Everything that we do is because we have somehow learned to do that. I talked about John Watson and the little Albert experiment, with being able to classically condition a human, very influential. And then, of course, Pavlov's work with dogs. Pavlov really kind of accidentally discovered classical conditioning with his work with the dogs. I will post a link on Ivan Pavlov and John Watson with the little Albert experiment in under chapter 4 in D2L, so you can take a look at both of those. I'm writing myself a note right now. So be sure to take a look at those. We'll give you an idea of really what classical conditioning is all about. But really kind of keep in mind that classical conditioning is related to involuntary reflexive behavior and doesn't really have a lot of application when it comes to voluntary behavior, which criminal behavior is voluntary. All right, I talked about B.F. Skinner in the 1950s with operant conditioning. And again, operant conditioning is related to voluntary behavior. And it's the idea that, again, behavior is shaped and maintained by its rewards or punishments. And because it's related to voluntary behavior, it really is applicable to criminal behavior. So the concepts that go along with operant conditioning is the idea of reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is really kind of the hallmark of changing behavior. So positive reinforcement is we gain something we desire as a consequence of a behavior. And when we get something we want, it increases the likelihood that we're going to do that behavior again. So if we, for example, break into a house and we gain monetary item, money or valuables, that is a reward for us, and it increases the likelihood that we are going to break into a house again. That's how you could apply that to criminal behavior. Negative reinforcement is avoiding something unpleasant as a consequence of a certain behavior. So and again, it increases the likelihood that a behavior will be repeated. So if you manage to, let's say, break into a house in a particular way and avoid detection, you have now avoided being arrested. So it increases the likelihood that you will use that type of breaking into the house again because you avoided detection. Now, Skinner also addressed punishment. Now, he didn't believe that punishment works. If you want to change behavior for the long haul, he suggested positive reinforcement. Punishment is the idea that if we do something and we experience something that we don't like, a negative consequence, it's supposed to decrease the likelihood that we would do a behavior again. Our entire criminal justice system is based on the idea of punishment. If you break the law in this country, you are punished, you go to jail, you are fined. If you commit homicide in a capital in a case that has in a state that has capital punishment, you will lose your life. And so it is the idea that you receive something bad, and the consequence should be that you don't do that behavior again. We know that we have really high recidivism rates here in the United States, so punishment doesn't theoretically really work in terms of changing behavior long term. But he knew that we like punishment in the United States, whether it's with the criminal justice system or with the way that we raise children or things like that. So he did address it. So operant learning and crime. So criminal behavior is learned and strengthened because of the reinforcement it brings. So you get either monetary rewards, you get, so you get money, you get goods, you get stereos, you get whatever, or you get some type of emotional or psychological pleasure out of it. And we see that a lot with like serial killers or rapists, child molesters who are getting some type of pleasure out of their offending, and that increases the likelihood that they're going to continue those behaviors because they're getting those that pleasure from it. So in order to eliminate crime, according to operant conditioning, you have to design a society in which members learn very early that positive reinforcement will not occur if they transgress against these rules and regulations. So you have to reward people. If you're going to kind of look, just at behaviorism, you have to kind of design a society where people are rewarded for not engaging in criminal behavior. And you also have to have punishment that is really swift. That brings us to social learning theory. Remember, social learning theory is based on the work of Albert Bandura. I will put up a link to his very first study called the Bobo doll study, which is what social learning theory was actually based on. So I'll put up a link so you can watch that. So again, he suggested that we learn some of our behaviors, and that includes criminal behaviors or aggressive behaviors, by modeling or imitating those around us in our social environment. So again, that can be with family, friends, your culture, your neighborhood. And there's even been research with social learning theory on violence in video games, violence in television shows, things like that. Expectancy theory, this is by Julian Rotter. He focuses on the importance of expectations about the consequences of behavior. It suggests at some level we ask ourselves, what happens to me before in this situation, and what will I gain this time? Expectancy theory argues that a performance level, or behavior is what they're talking about, is based on that person's expectations that behaving in a particular way will lead to a given outcome. When people engage in criminal behavior, they expect to gain something in the form of status, power, security, affection, material goods, or living conditions. If previously that behavior met those expectations, they're probably going to engage in that behavior again with the expectations that those needs will be met, or they'll get those things out of that behavior again. A lot of Albert Bandura's research with social learning theory was on aggression and violence, by the way. The famous Bobo style study that I'll post a link to was actually with kids and aggression. Would they model aggressive behavior? So make sure you take a look at that. It's super interesting. And it's always interesting to look at footage from early psychology experiments as well. All right. With social learning theory, it really is imitation or modeling. Both of those terms can be used when you talked about social learning theory. It's actually very influential on children. Children model and imitate behavior a lot from people around them, their parents, their siblings, their friends. And certainly, while that becomes less likely as we get a little bit older, it can be very influential, on up into early adulthood. The more significant a person is in our life, the more we respect a person, the more that we admire a person, the more likely we are to model their behavior. That's why we tend to model a lot of our behaviors by our family of origin and our friends, people that we respect. But that can even go out a little bit further into your neighborhood, to the subculture that you grow up in. When you think about gangs, a lot of people that join gangs are very influential in their neighborhoods, and in their environment. And gang members in some neighborhoods are very respected. And so it explains why a lot of people join gangs in particular. All right, frustration-induced criminality. When behavior directed at a specific goal is blocked, arousal increases and the individual experiences a drive to reduce it. So humans and other organisms often become more energetic and vigorous in reaching a goal when previously successful approaches don't work. It just means that we become physically aroused. Our adrenaline kicks in, our sympathetic nervous system kick in. So these arousal responses result from an adverse internal state called frustration. When we can't get what we want, it causes frustration, which is an aroused physical state in us, and it kind of motivates us to find some way to get what we want. Berkowitz in 1962 conducted numerous studies on frustration and criminal behavior. He divided criminal personalities into two main classifications. Socialized, he said these offenders they're the product of learning, conditioning, and modeling. They offend because they have learned to offend and because they expect rewards. And then we have individual. Offender is the product of a long, at times intense series of frustrations resulting from unmet needs. So socialized is more on social learning theory. Individual is that criminal behavior is really kind of the induced, the product of a long and intense series of frustrations in life from having your needs unmet, individual needs unmet. There are a lot of different types of frustration-induced criminal behavior, and that's what we were just talking about there. But the more intense and frequent the person's thwarting or frustration in a person's life, the more susceptible and sensitive the person is to subsequent frustrations. In other words, Berkowitz and others have found that kids who don't get what they want, their needs aren't met. We're just not talking about they don't get the video game. They don't get their needs met. They have neglect from their parents. They have societal problems in their neighborhoods that just cause a lot of frustration. They're definitely more susceptible to having that frustration boil over in some type of behavior that we might see manifested in criminal behavior. Examples of frustration-induced crime: riots. Frustration-induced theory helps to explain the behavior of looters during unexpected events like flood fires, blackouts, and even riots. If you think back, this is before a lot of you were born, but we had the LA riots back in 1993 based on the Rodney King case. If you don't know about Rodney King was a man that was beaten by white police officers in Los Angeles, and part of it was filmed. And the police officers were found not guilty. And when they were found not guilty, the community erupted in frustration. And it wasn't just from that case; it was from years and years of conflict between the LAPD and certain neighborhoods in Los Angeles. I happened to live in LA at the time. I'm from California. And I remember those riots, and they were terrifying. More recent examples would be the Ferguson shooting, where after that shooting, we saw a lot of frustration, and riots even erupted in that neighborhood following the shooting of a young man in that community by police officers. And again, it wasn't just that incident. It was years and years and years of frustration that built up in the community because of the problematic relationship between the police in that neighborhood and the residents of that neighborhood. Another example would be Hurricane Katrina. If you go to YouTube, you can see videos of people looting businesses during the flooding after the hurricane in New Orleans. Property crime and looting is a reflection of the frustration of the community and the official response to meet the needs of the people that were left there. Most of the people that looted those stores were looking for food and water and diapers and things like that. I mean, you definitely see people, taking skis out of shops and radios, which they didn't need. But most of the things that were looted were actually things that people that needed to survive. And it was based on, frustration of being stuck there in that heat with nobody coming to rescue them for so long. So those are examples of frustration-induced criminality. With juvenile delinquency, Berkowitz also did some research in that area, and he hypothesized that, again, the more intense and more frequent frustrations that a young person has, the more likely they are to kind of have a short fuse, and their frustration is going to kind of bubble over. His work and other studies have shown that delinquent children have had considerably more deprivation and frustration than non-delinquent children in their childhood. Berkowitz also suggests that parental neglect and failure to meet a child's needs creates mistrust and frustration, and that can, of course, continue on. And again, just cause people to have maybe a shorter fuse, and so they're more likely to erupt with frustration. All right, situational instigators and regulators. Most theories and research support the view that human behavior results from a complicated interaction between personality traits and situational variables. Some social scientists, mostly psychologists, suggest that much of crime theory and research neglects situational variables in favor of looking at dispositional or personality traits. So it's just suggesting that sometimes we are quick to blame behavior on personality traits, and we ignore the situational factors that could be, contributing to that behavior. We're ignoring the social factors that could be contributing. The fundamental attribution error or bias is very popular in psychology. It's called fundamental because it happens so much. We humans tend to view behavior as being the result of internal or dispositional factors, personality, and completely ignore the role situational factors could play. So, for example, your friend is mean to you one day or says something, nasty to you, and you kind of assume, oh my gosh, that person is such a jerk, and clearly doesn't like me anymore, when it could be something that has to do with their personal situation. Maybe they just had a fight with somebody. Maybe they're not feeling well, but we tend to, and it's just one of those things that we humans tend to do. We tend to look at internal factors. So with criminal behavior, sometimes we are quick to say that's just an evil person, and sometimes that might be true, but we tend to ignore some of the social factors that also contribute to behavior. So, how could this apply to our judgment that people make in terms of looters in New Orleans after Katrina? We could look at those videos of people taking stuff out of stores and say, "Oh my gosh, those people are just, criminals. They're breaking into stores and stealing stuff." But again, we're ignoring the situational factors of they're stuck in a city after a hurricane that's flooded. It's hot. Nobody's coming to help them. They can't get food and water any other way. They can't get baby food. They can't get diapers. Their only choice is to break into stores and get that because nobody else is helping them. So it kind of helps us to understand some behavior. The self-serving bias, this is also something that just tends to be something that humans do. When something good happens to us or when we succeed, we tend to explain it in terms of internal factors. I do well on a test, so I think, oh my gosh, I'm so smart. I studied so hard. I'm the best. I'm the greatest. But when something bad happens to us, we tend to blame situational factors. So I don't do so well on a test, and I say, oh, my neighbor was too loud. I couldn't study. I had to work late. I couldn't study. The professor is not fair with his or her testing. So when we succeed, we take credit for it. When we fail, we tend to blame other people. So it's just something that we humans tend to do. The other thing with victimology is I mentioned this in a previous lecture. Those just world hypotheses, the idea that if somebody is victimized, they must have deserved it, and that's why I said that those just world hypotheses and theories are not really terribly prevalent because we never want to blame a victim for their victimization. But it happens a lot when you have crimes where people have put themselves, in a bad situation. It does happen with those. Alrighty, let's see, other situational factors, crimes of obedience. A crime of obedience is an act performed in response to orders from somebody that is perceived as an authority figure. So war crimes from World War II, Vietnam, Watergate, Abu Ghraib prison scandal, based on, well, let me just go back. Stanley Milgram was a famous social psychologist who was intrigued by the actions of the soldiers in World War II, the German soldiers, who followed orders to put humans in ovens and to do all kinds of horrific things to humans. And he couldn't understand why, seemingly normal young German soldiers would do these horrific things. So he did this very famous experiment called the Stanley Milgram study. And I'll post a link to a video on that. And what he found with his work is that people tend to follow orders from from people that they perceive as being authority figures, like police officers or somebody that is in a position of authority. So it does happen that people could engage in criminal behavior because they are following the orders of somebody that they perceive as being in a position of authority to them. Deindividuation, Leon Festinger talked about this in 1952, and it could be related to behavior in crowds. And so when we were talking a minute ago about frustration-induced riots or looting or things like that, Festinger found that in crowds or large groups, people may lose their sense of individuality, remove their self-imposed controls, and neutralize their internal restraints. Philip Zimbardo, also a very famous social psychologist, expanded on these ideas and suggested that de-individuation follows a complex chain of events. Number one, the presence of others encourages feelings of anonymity. If you're in a crowd, you don't feel like you are being looked at as an individual. So you can kind of lose your sense of self. Second, we lose identity and become part of the group. And third, under those conditions, there is no fear of, being looked upon individually. You kind of lose your individuality in the crowd, and your constraints go down, and you're more likely to, according to Festinger and Zimbardo and others, engage in behavior that you might not otherwise engage in if you were by yourself or if you could be looked at individually. Philip Zimbardo actually did a very famous study called the Stanford Prison Experiment back in the 70s. And there's a link to the documentary on that under this chapter. I encourage you to watch that. But what he found was that we can't minimize the power of situational factors, that when we get in certain situations, he said we can kind of divorce ourselves from our regular personality and our regular constraints, and we can find ourselves engaging in behaviors that are kind of really not like us normally. So situational factors can cause us to engage in behaviors that we normally wouldn't engage in. He actually wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect that really goes deeply into that. But I definitely encourage you to watch the Stanford Prison Experiment. It's super interesting. And he talks a little bit about that idea that we divorce ourselves from who we really are in certain circumstances. Now, by the way, this is not an excuse for criminal behavior, but it might help us to understand behavior a little bit better if we're willing to look at the situational factors that are surrounding any particular behavior. With de-individuation and crowd violence, again, it's just the idea that we get into this, that we get into these settings, these situational factors where we can kind of blend in with the crowd, and we don't feel like we're being looked at individually. There's 100 people, so nobody's looking at us individually, so we don't feel like our behavior can be checked. And it could explain why we see people that would never act violent throw things in riots, or break things in riots, or set things on fire, where they have never done anything like that in their whole life. The bystander effect. The bystander effect is an interesting concept in social psychology, where it suggests that when there are a lot of people around, we don't feel personally responsible, so we're less likely to intervene. It's based off of a very famous case that was back in the 1980s, the case of Kitty Genovese. Kitty was a young woman who lived in, I believe it was Brooklyn in New York, and she came home late one night, and she had to park her car across the street from her apartment building. And so she parked her car and walked across the street. And when she was walking across the street, a man attacked her. And her screams were heard by, I think, 60-something people inside her apartment building. And not one person intervened. I think a couple of people turned their lights on, and the guy ran away. But then he noticed that nobody came out to help her, even though she was screaming. And so he went back and attacked her a second time. She crawled up to, I think a light scared him again. She managed to crawl up to her doorstep, but nobody still intervened. Nobody called the police. Nobody went down. Nobody yelled out the window. And so it became like, what is wrong with people that all these people would hear somebody screaming and needing help and nobody would intervene? And by the way, the guy came back 3 times, and on the third time, he actually killed Kitty. So she was sexually assaulted and killed, with all of these people reporting that they actually saw or heard what was going on. And so they started doing research on this in the 1960s, and they found what they called the bystander effect. When there are a lot of people around, we assume somebody else is going to be intervening. So all of those people in that apartment building who heard her screaming assumed somebody else was calling the police, assumed somebody else was going to yell out the window, assumed. So that's what the bystander effect is. Moral disengagement. This was studied by Albert Bandura, who we talked about with social learning theory. Albert Bandura proposed that the concept of moral disengagement to explain why people do immoral or heinous acts that go against their own morals and values when ordered to do so. Bandura believed it was not simply the power of the situation, like Zimbardo said. He said people must also disengage from their own moral sanctions to avoid self condemnation. Bandura found through studies that delinquents rely heavily on moral justification and dehumanization of their victims. Bandura found that male adolescents were more prone to disengage than females. It's the idea that you are able to kind of morally divorce yourself from your morals, and you're able to justify that. You dehumanize your victim, you detach from your moral principles, and that allows you to engage in behavior that you might not otherwise engage in. All right, so a lot of really interesting information in this chapter. Make sure you look at some of the resources posted under Chapter 4 in D2L. Let me know if you have any questions on anything in the chapter, and have a great day.